There's only one gospel, and to add anything to this gospel is to pervert it, and that includes the law of Moses. Learn more on this program today. We welcome you to another teaching put out by Living Logos Ministries this week, and we thank you for tuning in. We believe you're going to be blessed by what we're sharing right now, where we're sharing through the book of Galatians. And this is something that, as Living Logos Ministries, we believe that the Word needs to be made alive to us. And I believe the book of Galatians is one of the first books we need to have our eyes open to, because it's imperative that we as believers have our lives freed from legalism. And we understand that it's all because of Jesus that we are what we are. Amen. Understanding the grace of God is super important. And Paul thought so as well. So we're looking here in Galatians chapter 1, and last week we ended with verse 5. And so now I want to move on to verse 6, where there's a little bit of a transition in the letter. After his introduction and saying who he's writing to and basically giving them a blessing and giving them a little concise gospel in verse 4. In verse 6, he begins by saying, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from Him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, the first thing I need to say about these verses is that it's usually at this point in Paul's letters where he begins to commend the people he's writing to. He begins to say some positive things about how he's heard about their faith, and he's praising them for the love they have for one another. Paul skips over all of that. He does not give any words of encouragement or praise to this church. He gets right to he addresses the elephant in the room and starts getting right into what they missed it on. And that's interesting to me, because when you go back and study some of these other churches that Paul found something positive to say about, some of these churches were a mess, like the church of Corinth, who was spiritual babies, and he still finds something good to say about them, not the churches of Galatia. So what that teaches me is that doctrinal apostasy is more of a serious thing to Paul and the Holy Ghost than our spiritual maturity. That's important to understand, because a lot of times we think because I'm holy enough and I'm acting right that that's really what God's focused on. No, it's what you believe that's important to God. And that's why he gets right into this by saying, I marvel that you're turning away. The word marvel here describes, I'm shocked, I'm floored, I cannot believe it, that you are turning away. Now this is interesting, because when you look these words turning away up, it literally describes deserting or transferring or changing sides. So what Paul is saying to this church right here is that you are not just going AWOL in the army of the Lord, you're changing sides altogether. Now that's strong, because what he's telling them is you guys are doing the worst thing you could possibly do. By turning away from the gospel of grace that I've delivered to you, Paul's saying, and turning into something else and mixing law in with it, what you're doing is the gravest of all sins. It's called apostasy. So he says that you're turning away so soon. Now that's interesting to me, is that he's marveling that it happens so quickly. Now, you know why this happens? The Bible actually teaches us. If you look in Mark chapter 4, where Jesus is teaching on the parable of the sower, he says that if somebody is stony ground, if there are rocks in their heart is hardened, then when the trials and tribulations come, they can immediately fall away. Why? This is a product of a hardened heart. Somebody who never let the root system of the truths that they heard get down in their heart. That's why it's so important for you and I, saints, to make sure our root system goes deep so that our flower does not fade in the day where somebody's coming to try to teach us something differently. We need to be rooted and grounded in what we know to be true. So he said, I marvel, I'm floored. I can't believe that you guys are deserting so soon. Notice this, from Him who called you in the grace of Christ. They were not turning away from a philosophy, from a teaching, from even a person. Paul says right here, you're turning away from Him who called you. See, because I would suppose that the Galatian believers thought they were just turning away from Paul because they're turning away from his gospel and they're turning to a different kind of gospel. Paul is saying right here, no, it's not me you're turning away from. You're turning away from the one who called you in the grace of Christ. Did you know the Lord takes it personally when we reject His messengers? So when they thought they were rejecting Paul, they were rejecting the Lord. That's a serious matter. And notice what he says. You've turned away from Him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. The word different here comes from the Greek word heteros, where we get an English word heterosexual from. Now, what is a heterosexual? A heterosexual is a person who is attracted to a person, another person, of a different sex, right? So what he's saying right here is you've turned to something that is completely different. It's not the same at all. Now, the King James Version says, to another gospel, and then it goes on to say in verse 7, which is not another. That seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it? But no, what Paul is saying right here is you've turned away to another of a different kind of gospel. There are not different kinds of gospels out there. Because that's why he goes on to say in verse 7, which is not another, meaning the word another there is the Greek word allos, which means another of the same kind. It's an exact representation. You could say it's like a twin. It's identical. So what he's saying right here is, you guys have turned to a different kind of gospel, but there's really not another kind of gospel like the gospel you've heard from me. It's like, the best analogy I've ever seen to compare this is, it's like comparing apples and oranges. Paul's like saying, these are not even in the same ballpark, man. These are completely different gospels. Because when you start adding Jesus plus Moses, which is Jesus plus the works of the law, then it's not completely pure Jesus. You have perverted it. And that's why he goes on to say what he just said next. But there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. And see, this is what legalism will do, is that when we allow legalism in our life, when we begin to give heed to and start listening to other forms of teaching that are starting to put more emphasis on us than on Jesus, guess what happens? It'll trouble you. And this word trouble literally means to agitate. It means to perplex. It means to disturb. Did you know, if you want to have peace in your life, it's got to be only Jesus. It's got to only be a focus on what Jesus has done. And to me, this is such an important point of how we can receive peace and grace in our life. Peace always actually comes on the tail end of grace. That's why I believe Paul always began his letters with grace and peace, because the peace comes after the grace. So if we want to have peace in our life, you got to get our focus on Jesus. When we get our focus on ourselves, it's going to trouble us. And it's called perverting the gospel of Christ. So what we need to understand and take away from this today is there's only one gospel, and it's Jesus plus nothing. When we start adding together the works of the law and things that we've got to do to be pleasing to God, we are going to live a troubled life where we're not going to have the peace that we could have. So I encourage you today, if you've missed any of these teachings, go back and listen to some of the prior ones. We'll have the information here on the screen momentarily. I've also written a gospel commentary on the book of Galatians, and we'll send this to you free of charge if you'll just contact us. But we thank you for tuning in this week, and we hope you'll tune in again next week. God bless you.